Alright, imagine this. You're buckled into your seat, the engines are roaring, and the plane begins to climb. You feel the pressure change, your ears pop, and somewhere around 10 minutes into the flight, you level out. The seatbelt sign dings off. The flight attendants start rolling their carts down the aisle. The pilot announces, "We've reached our cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. But have you ever stopped and asked, why 35,000 feet? Why not 20,000? Or 50,000? What's so special about that number? And who decided it?" Let's take off on this journey and explore the surprising science, history, and strategy behind why airplanes fly at such specific altitudes, and what would happen if they didn't. The sweet spot in the sky. Let's start with the basics. Commercial airliners typically cruise between 33,000 and 42,000 feet, with 35,000 feet being a kind of sweet spot. But this isn't random. At this altitude, the air is thinner, which means less drag on the aircraft. Less drag equals less fuel burned equals more efficient flight. But go too high, engines lose performance. Go too low, fuel costs skyrocket and turbulence becomes a real problem. So, it's a delicate balancing act between physics, fuel, and efficiency. A matter of fuel efficiency. Jet engines work best at high altitudes where the air is cold and thin. Why? Well, thin air means there's less resistance pushing back on the plane. And cold air helps the engine burn fuel more efficiently. Combine the two, and you're maximizing your range without carrying extra fuel weight. Let's put it in perspective. Cruising at 35,000 feet can improve fuel efficiency by up to 30% compared to flying at lower altitudes. And for airlines, that's a huge cost-saving advantage. Now multiply that by hundreds of aircraft operating thousands of flights daily, and you start to see why this matters. Weather, turbulence, and the jet stream. Here's another reason planes fly that high, to avoid the chaos below. At lower altitudes, the sky is full of weather systems, clouds, storms, and turbulence. But by the time you're at 35,000 feet, you're above most of that mess. Not all of it, though. Some turbulence still lurks up there, especially near the jet stream, a high-altitude river of fast-moving air. Pilots and dispatchers actually plan routes around or even with the jet stream to save time and fuel. Sometimes, flying with a tailwind in the jet stream can shave 30 to 45 minutes off a flight from LA to New York. Other times, a plane will climb or descend slightly to escape chop. Why not fly even higher? Fair question. You might think, if high altitude equals better fuel economy, why not go higher? Well, there's a limit, set by both technology and biology. At around 40,000 to 45,000 feet, jet engines start to lose thrust. The air gets too thin to sustain combustion efficiently. That's why only certain aircraft, like the Concorde or military jets, could cruise higher, sometimes up to 60,000 feet. But it's also about cabin pressure. Human bodies need oxygen, and the cabin has to maintain a livable pressure equivalent to around 8,000 feet above sea level. Go higher, and the pressure difference between inside and outside the aircraft becomes too extreme. That stresses the fuselage and increases the risk of decompression. So, 35,000 feet is kind of the Goldilocks zone. Not too high. Not too low. Just right. Air traffic control and altitude stacking. There's also the issue of traffic. The sky isn't just an open playground. It's a finely choreographed ballet of aircraft, managed by Air Traffic Control (ATC). Every flight is assigned a specific altitude depending on its direction, location, and flight plan. Eastbound flights usually cruise at odd-numbered altitudes, like 33,000 or 35,000 feet. Westbound? Even-numbered altitudes, 34,000 or 36,000 feet. This system is called semicircular altitude rule, and it helps prevent mid-air collisions by literally separating traffic by thousands of feet. In high-traffic zones, ATC will stack flights in layers, like a giant sky sandwich of aluminum tubes moving at 500 miles an hour. The climb and descent puzzle. Now, getting to and from 35,000 feet isn't just about pointing the nose up or down. There's an entire science behind climb profiles and descents. Pilots have to factor in fuel burn, engine wear, passenger comfort, noise restrictions near cities, and airspace limitations. Ever notice how a flight might level off briefly before climbing again? That's often because ATC is sequencing traffic or holding you temporarily to avoid congestion at higher altitudes. Emergencies at altitude. One of the risks of high-altitude flight is what happens if something goes wrong. If there's a sudden loss of cabin pressure at 35,000 feet, passengers have about 15 to 30 seconds of useful consciousness before hypoxia sets in. That's why oxygen masks drop automatically, and pilots immediately begin an emergency descent to 10,000 feet or below, where you can breathe normally. But don't panic, commercial jets are designed to handle these scenarios, and crews train for them constantly. So, who decided 35,000 feet? It's less about one person or committee and more about decades of trial, error, data, and technology. As engines improved and airspace management became more sophisticated, 35,000 feet emerged as the global standard for balancing efficiency, safety, and logistics. You could say the sky kind of found its own level. Fun fact: the Concorde flew at 60,000 feet. The Concorde, the legendary supersonic jet, cruised way higher, around 60,000 feet. At that altitude, you could see the curvature of the Earth. But that required a very different design and came with insane fuel consumption. That's one reason Concorde tickets cost thousands of dollars and why the plane eventually retired. Final thoughts. The next time you look out the window and see the clouds drifting far below, remember, you're cruising through a very specific altitude for very good reasons. It's not just about reaching a destination. It's about optimizing physics, economics, safety, and airspace in a world where millions of people take to the skies every day. 35,000 feet isn't just a number. It's a carefully chosen altitude that represents the intersection of science, strategy, and sky-high human ambition. So next time the captain says, "We've reached cruising altitude," you'll know exactly why that matters. If you enjoyed this sky-high breakdown of aviation strategy, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more deep dives into the systems that shape our modern world. Stay curious. Stay grounded. And I'll see you in the next one.